we still have to figure out exactly what the Italians are voting on. Are they going to the polls on Sunday, and are they concerned about immigration? Are they concerned about the economy? Or do they just want lower taxes?
It's a mix of these factors. Certainly there's a great emphasis on domestic security. Wherever you look, you find that both anti-establishment parties and mainstream parties are campaigning strongly on domestic security. Even the PD, Partito Democratico, is kind of having a double speak. On the one hand, it upholds social rights, integration, and on the other hand, the Minister of Interior has an iron fist. So certainly domestic security, if I had to choose.
Okay, what does it mean for the election on Sunday? So we cannot talk polls. We're in a blackout period. What we can talk about is possible scenarios. Is it more likely that we get a hung parliament and that it will take weeks to form a coalition, or can we see a grand coalition? It's a new electoral law, so I guess the moving parts are pretty big.
Yes, depending on how many Italians actually go to the polls, we can end up with at least two scenarios. One is a scenario in which we have a standalone absolute majority. That could be centre-right. Or we could end up with a hung parliament and a broad coalition or new elections. Broad coalition is something we must elaborate on a little bit, because in the past, broad coalition would have meant a bipartisan coalition, mainstream coalition made up of Forza Italia and the Partito Democratico. These days, none of those parties has the strength to reach out to the other one.
What does it mean for businesses, right? What should they worry about?
It means that if we end up with a broad coalition, there could be anti-establishment components in it. So what is it we have to worry from the point of view of business? Reforms. What is left of reforms? How much can a broad and diverse coalition actually deliver in terms of reforms? In all my talks with investors, I found that these days there's a great deal of expectation for justice reform. Every time reforms means something different. Sometimes it means privatizations and liberalizations. Sometimes it means labor reforms. These days, I think it means justice reform. But justice reform require very broad majorities. And I'm not sure that this is where we are going.
Silvio Berlusconi, as one of his platforms, although he can't be elected because he's been banned from public office, was proposing a 23% flat tax. First of all, is that fundable? And does it mean for the deficit?
Whether it's fundable or not, we will see. Certainly, the Ministry of Finance is already looking into that, because so many political forces have been proposing a flat tax with different rates. Even Lega Nord has one, and the left too is kind of thinking of that. The Five Stars, they're all thinking of flat tax. But it signals that political forces believe taxation is a major element in this campaign. Again, we do not know who'll be the next Minister of Finance.
Of course. We don't even know who's going to be Prime Minister or what kind of coalition will be put in place. Francesco, talk to me a little bit about the euro. So what is the relationship of Italy and the euro? You have parties that by history could be more Eurosceptic, but there's no getting Italy out of the euro in any of the platforms. Is it because the Italians have the support of the euro, the currency?
Certainly, the honeymoon is over, but that doesn't mean Italy has become Eurosceptic to a point of pulling the plug. Even the parties like Lega Nord and Five Stars, who at the beginning, a few years ago, were calling for a referendum to leave the euro, they have made a U-turn. So these days, there's no one saying we will leave the euro. A few isolated cases here and there, like Lega Nord has a Professor Alberto Bagnai who's still on that wavelength, but that is the exception. And nobody these days is Eurosceptic in that in that sense.
If you're an economist and you look at the Italian numbers, so GDP was up 1.5%, unemployment is being tackled. Sure, we're not at 7% like we were pre-crisis, but we went from 13% to 10.3%. Why do Italians not feel the recovery? Is there a concern that actually, if you look at the numbers, it feels pretty good, but for the person on the street, they're just not seeing the kind of them being out of the woods?
Because it's mostly export-led. And because of that, a lot of the supply chains and the value creation chains are outside this country. And if you look at the components of our GDP growth, there's little that is domestic, so no infrastructure, very little of that, and no real estate either. So the people in the street are not really happy.
Okay, what we heard also yesterday from President Trump slapping those tariffs possibly on steel and aluminum, actually saying that he will very shortly. What does it mean for Italy? If you have such an export-led economy, will a kind of America First policy really hurt this country more than other European ones?
Italian exports have shown pretty resilient over the years, with a capacity to adapt to changing circumstances. So we are seeing, for instance, a surge of exports towards China and Russia. So I think we'll just look at what's happening around, and we're quite global in reach. We're not regional. So we ship goods and services everywhere.
Francesco, do you think that a lot of people will go and vote? The weather is not great today. We were talking about the undecided voters. Again, does turnout, is it key for the market stability?
It is, because if very few people go to polls, then it means that the relative strength of organized minorities is amplified. So if we look at non-voters or undecided voters, many of them, millions actually, come from the center-right. These are all former Berlusconi voters or former Lega Nord voters. Yes, some of them are these days are also coming from the left because they've become fed up with the frictions within the center-left. But these people, we do not know how they'll react to what's happening these days, whether they will, despite everything, they will flow back to the polls and vote for the lesser evil, the devil they know, the safest pair of hands, or whether seeing the old faces, same old faces around, they'll decide to bring down the system once and forever, voting anti-establishment, or they'll simply remain out of vote.